A very good afternoon, everyone. Hope you had a nice lunch. I, first of all, would like to say a very big thank you to RSIS for this event. Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this invitation to address you on what I regard as one of the most critical issues of our time, which is the increasing complexity. I think it's a bit high, huh? Yeah, I'm a bit short. I should actually stand on it. The increasing complexity of humanitarian challenges facing our world today, and our capacity as an international and regional community to respond to them. So basically, it's the increasing complexity of humanitarian challenges and our capacity to respond to these challenges. So let me start by giving you what I see as the humanitarian context, both globally as well as in the Asia-Pacific region. Today's world is characterized by great uncertainty, instability, and inequality. While progress continues to be made in many parts of the world, including in meeting some of the Millennium Development Goals that we committed to as an international community 15 years ago, we have at the same time witnessed a surge in humanitarian crises around the world. The numbers are truly alarming. In just over 10 years, the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance has more than doubled. Just think of these figures. In mid-2005, around 40 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance. 10 years later, by June 2015, the number of people in need stood at an alarming 82.5 million people. Also last month, in conjunction with the World Refugee Day, the High Commissioner for Refugees announced that nearly 60 million people today are displaced, the highest number since the end of World War II. Of these 60 million, half are children, and a staggering 1 in every 122 people today is internally displaced, a refugee, or seeking asylum. The war in Syria alone has left more than 10 million people in need within the country, and more than 4 million refugees across the region, with no end in sight to many of the world's conflicts, and with new disasters and crises likely to unfold. These figures will no doubt continue to rise as the root causes of these crises are not urgently nor easily addressed. While the modern world has never been without humanitarian crises, our recent crises are unique, not only because of their intensity and the cumulative scale of needs they create, but also because of their diversity, ranging from wars to natural disasters, health epidemics to food security crises, their interconnectedness and their transnational nature. In the past few years alone, we have witnessed the civil war in Syria, which has killed more than 220,000 people and displaced more than 10 million since it began, the current civil war in Yemen, where 80% of the population are now in need of assistance, sectarian violence and breakdown of law and order in the Central African Republic, the resumption of armed conflict in South Sudan, the Ebola epidemic, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, recurring food crises in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa, the protracted humanitarian crisis in Gaza, ongoing displacement and chronic humanitarian needs in many parts of Myanmar, including in the Rakhine State, Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, the massive earthquake in Nepal, and the ongoing humanitarian crises at sea of refugees, victims of trafficking and migrants in the Mediterranean and the Andaman Sea. I can go on, but this just gives you a picture of the multiplicity and the scale of the crises that we are facing today, both man-made as well as natural. Ladies and gentlemen, no region in the world is immune from humanitarian crises, and Asia-Pacific is no exception. In spite of being an economically dynamic region that has come a long way in eradicating poverty and meeting the development needs of our citizens, Asia-Pacific has many of the world's most climate-exposed territories and is the most disaster-prone region in the world. A person living in Asia-Pacific is 4 times more likely to be affected by natural disasters than someone living in Africa. Just think of that. And 25 times more likely than someone living in Europe or in North America. Between 2004 and 2013, out of the world's total reported disaster incidents, as much as 41.2%, or in terms of numbers, 1,690 incidents occurred in Asia-Pacific region alone. In 2014, 80 million people were affected by natural disasters in our region. In fact, 75% of the global disasters deaths occurred in Asia. In 2011, economic damages and losses from natural and climate-related disasters in the region total more than US $293 billion. Coupled with economic shocks, these disasters can wipe away years of development gains in seconds, increasing economic, social, and political vulnerabilities, and can quickly become a cascade of crises. Hence, climate change and threats to our ecosystems are perhaps the most important long-term challenges facing this region and beyond. We are also home, ladies and gentlemen, to some of the world's most deadly and longest-running sub-regional conflicts. A recent Asia Foundation study found that over the past 20 years, there have been no less than 26 sub-regional conflicts in South and Southeast Asia alone. That 131 million people live in areas affected by such conflicts. Let us also not forget that Asia-Pacific is home to 80% of the world's hungry, with more than 900 million people living on less than $2 a day. This means that external shocks, whether from typhoons, from floods, from earthquakes, epidemics, or conflict, have the potential to throw millions into abject poverty and make it more difficult for them to meet their basic needs and to access aid and vital services, leading to grievances. In all these situations, it is always vulnerable people, such as the elderly, women and children, who suffer more acutely, exposed to sexual violence and are at risk of exclusion. Poverty and vulnerability also drives people into situations of risk and exploitation that have dire humanitarian consequences, such as we all have witnessed with the recent uncovered slave labor fishing operation in the Maluku Islands, the trafficking camps and mass graves in Thailand and Malaysia, and the crisis of Bangladeshi migrants and victims of trafficking, and the Rohingya refugees stranded at sea. So, ladies and gentlemen, with this scale of the crisis in both the world, and I showed you also in Asia, despite the fact that it's regarded as rising Asia, the international humanitarian system is at breaking point. In the face of these multiple humanitarian crises, the international humanitarian system, led by the United Nations, the Red Cross, and the key humanitarian agencies, is under unprecedented strain and is being stretched to its limits. This fact is well accepted among the world's international leaders. The United Kingdom Secretary of International Development, Justine Greening, has said that the global humanitarian aid system is being, and I quote her, stretched to breaking point, unquote, by disasters, climate change, and war, and must be overhauled. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, went even further, stating at Davos earlier this year that, and I quote him, "After the many terrible crises of the past 3 years, we have now surpassed that breaking point. The international humanitarian community no longer has the capacity to respond. The aid architecture we built after the Second World War is no longer fit for purpose." End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, we are indeed in a crisis. Indeed, the international humanitarian system is struggling to respond to rising humanitarian needs caused by multiple large-scale and simultaneous crises. Even with the US $24.5 billion spent on humanitarian assistance in 2014, needs are quickly outstripping funds at a time when traditional aid donors are constrained by economic and unemployment crises at home following the 2008 global financial crisis and rise of anti-immigrant and refugee sentiments compared to what I would say the openness of the late 70s after the Vietnam War. But there are other challenges too, which are more systemic. And these are about how the humanitarian system itself is structured and how funding is channeled. In a recent report by the Local to Global Protection Initiative, it was revealed that in the current humanitarian system, about 30 humanitarian agencies, or 4% of the total number of emergency aid organizations, received 85% of the total funding reported to the UN financial tracking system last year. It is this system in which a humanitarian 1%, we always talked and hear about the development, the 1% in the development sphere, but we're talking here about the humanitarian 1%, controls resources and decision making, even as local and national actors are often the first responders on the ground. And it is that system that is failing to respond effectively to humanitarian needs and to protect people caught in crises. Change in the humanitarian system is urgently required. And this change must be comprehensive and global. It must go beyond reforming existing institutions like the United Nations and the Red Cross. It must recognize not only the changing nature of crises that I outlined, but also the changing landscape of development cooperation itself. We no longer live in a world where we can draw simple lines between aid donors and aid recipients. As the London-based Humanitarian Policy Group has said, and I quote them, "Today, emerging powers, non-OECD countries, middle-income countries, countries in transition, and even least developed countries are all playing a critical role in responding to humanitarian crises within and beyond their borders, complementing the work of traditional humanitarian actors," end of quote. It is also becoming increasingly recognized that the most established members of the international humanitarian system, the United Nations, the Red Cross, and the Western-based humanitarian NGOs, do not have a monopoly on the delivery of aid and services to alleviate the suffering of victims of conflict, disasters, and other crises. One striking feature of the new humanitarian landscape is the prominent role that states, regional actors, local civil society and communities, the private sector, faith-based organization, and as well as the diaspora now play in responding to crises. In fact, you may be interested to know that the developing world is hosting 90% of the world's refugees today. So, I would like to think and to discuss with you today, how do we work towards a new global humanitarian system? We must, in short, restructure the humanitarian system to make it more inclusive, so that different actors can cooperate in a complementary and coordinated manner to respond and prevent crises altogether. These problems and the need for fundamental change have now been recognized by the majority of international humanitarian donors, who are focusing increasingly on building the resilience of local communities and seeking ways of supporting a more diverse range of actors in humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and preparedness. So let me list to you what some of these diverse range of actors look like. National governments are among the most important actors in a crisis, and with the right partnership can be very effective in responding to crisis, as demonstrated by the government of Indonesia. And I know we have in the ASEAN ambassadors table a representative from Indonesia. So the leadership of the government of Indonesia's successful leadership of the Aceh tsunami response, and the Chinese government's response to the 2008 Sichuan earthquake. We must also recognize the life-saving role that militaries can play in emergency response, such as the Pakistan military in the aftermath of the 2005 earthquake and the 2010 floods that I was also involved with. And the Singapore military in Aceh tsunami-devastated West Coast, and in Nepal in the aftermath of the recent earthquake. And I would like to recognize Colonel Lim, your presence here, because you just came back from Nepal. Now, especially when civilian assets and capabilities are overwhelmed or simply unable to access remote disaster-affected areas, then I'm so pleased to see the ASEAN ambassadors. Regional intergovernmental organizations also have an important role to play in facilitating aid to crisis-affected communities, especially when national capacities are overwhelmed. Good examples include the OIC in Somalia and ASEAN acting as a bridge of trust in the aftermath of the 2008 Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, when the Burmese government at that time denied access to the international community. By building a tripartite relationship linking the government to the humanitarian community, ASEAN succeeded to coordinate the resources and efforts from the region and beyond to address a major humanitarian crisis. And then Ambassador Bunak, you played a major role, and I was very pleased to be part of that team as well. So ASEAN can do much more. There are many, many crises that still need your attention. The most critical actors, however, will continue to be local communities that themselves, and community-based organizations who are at the forefront of saving lives and preventing loss of life. Community actors in Bangladesh, for example, prove how effective community-led disaster preparedness and resilience can be in the face of Cyclone Sidra in 2007, in which fewer than 5,000 people lost their lives compared to 140,000 people in the cyclone before. More recently, local fishermen in Aceh, Indonesia, rescued more than 1,700 Rohingya refugees and Bangladeshi trafficked victims and migrants stranded for months at sea when other national, regional, and international systems failed to urgently respond to what was regarded as a sensitive and political problem. Not only did the fishermen prevent what I call a graveyard at sea, but the local community treated the refugees and migrants with great dignity, setting what I think is some of the best standards of humanitarian assistance. At the same time, we have the young generation of IT-savvy global citizens, and they are taking matters into their own hands, exploring ever more innovative ways of responding to humanitarian crises with the help of information technology. the Nepal earthquake response, for example, revealed the power of information technology with crisis mappers using platforms like OpenStreetMap to document damage in real time, and local organizations use crowdsourcing platforms to raise funds. It is also well recognized now that the role of the business sector in humanitarian response, disaster risk management, and building resilience of vulnerable communities is absolutely fundamental to the future of humanitarianism. And I'm so happy to see so many private sector people present in today's meeting as well. Public-private partnerships have long been embraced in development work, but they are newer and still underexplored phenomena in humanitarian assistance. While the humanitarian and private sectors may have different missions, principles, and ways of working, there are already many examples of initiatives that have had an enormous impact on crisis-affected community. In Haiti, for example, Digicel and Flowminder partnered to track populations displaced after the 2010 earthquake and the cholera outbreak, monitoring the movement of mobile phone users to conduct an analysis of mobile phone records and the geographic positions of SIM cards. And in Jordan today, local and regional businesses are working in partnership with the World Food Programme of the United Nations and MasterCard to enable Syrian refugees to buy their own food with food vouchers and designated supermarkets. But, ladies and gentlemen, expanding the playing field of humanitarian action and embracing innovation and partnership that I've discussed is only one part of the solution. In the most difficult humanitarian crises, where access to civilians in need is all but cut off, it is only those actors who are viewed as being neutral and impartial are able to negotiate for access to deliver aid. In Syria, for example, it is organizations like the Red Cross, and I know that the representative of the Red Cross in Singapore is here, as well as newer organizations like the courageous Syrian White Helmets. And these are ordinary volunteers from all walks of life who are working on the front lines of the war, evacuating casualties, providing treatment to the wounded, and giving the dead proper burials, adhering at every moment to the principles of humanity and impartiality. Thus, as much as the humanitarian model of the future must be diverse, as I have stressed, it must also be founded on universally accepted humanitarian principles and respect for international humanitarian law, human rights law, and the Refugee Convention and its protocol. These are the international UN treaties and frameworks that provide the foundation for protection of civilians and need to be more fully embraced. In the context that I have just painted, the establishment of RSIS, Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Response Program, could not be more timely. So congratulations. I'm therefore very pleased to help launch this program. However, I must say, I do have great expectations. And I know, Ambassador Ong, that you and your team will work hard to make a difference. What are some of the differences that you can make? The program has a critical role to play, not only in deepening the understanding and improving the capacity of actors in the region on humanitarian crises and effective response, but also in facilitating the emergence of a new humanitarian model of partnership by bringing together multiple stakeholders to forge solutions and partnerships in response to the humanitarian crises of today and tomorrow. And I'm very pleased to see that so many different stakeholders are present here today. The task ahead of all of you is extremely challenging, but ladies and gentlemen, humanity depends on it. I thank you.